What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hi there from sunny Los Angeles. How are you all? How was your weekend? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, which is brought to you by Kraken. I'm your host, Peter McCormack, and today I've got an interview with Michel Rauchs from the University of Cambridge Judge Business School, where we discuss their recently announced Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index. Wow, that's a mouthful. But anyway, before that, I've got a message from my show sponsors. So first up, today's show is brought to you by the world's best exchange, Kraken, and it's the only place I now use to buy and sell Bitcoin. And a few days ago, I finally got to record an episode with Kraken's Chief Security Officer, Nick Percoco, where we discuss a whole bunch of security-related topics. It's a show that's been in the planning for a while. I got out to Chicago and we did it. It's going to be released on Tuesday, July 22nd. You're not going to want to miss it. It's a great episode. And speaking with Nick only reinforced my belief and support of Kraken on why it's the only exchange I use, and it's the only exchange you should be using. Exchange security is so important. You are trusting these companies not to get hacked and not to lose your Bitcoin. And Kraken has security embedded into the company. It is part of their DNA. And also, on top of that, they created Kraken Security Labs, where they are looking to improve security across the entire industry. It's a no-brainer. If you want good security, you need to be using Kraken. So join me in supporting them. Head over to kraken.com, which is Kraken.com. That is kraken.com, which is Kraken.com. Also, today's show is brought to you by BlockFi. And also, on top of recording the show with Nick Percoco, I was in New York earlier in the week, and I managed to meet up with BlockFi Zach Prince and Jeremy Welch from Casa to discuss their recently announced partnership and some other bullish Bitcoin stuff. It's a great show. That's going to be coming out soon. Do you know about this partnership? It's really cool, actually. It gives BlockFi clients access to both market-leading financial services and a secure self-custody solution. Through the partnership, clients will be able to access Casa's multi-sig software for long-term savings and security. It's great to see two of my favorite companies working together. I love it. Totally badass. Through the partnership, BlockFi clients are eligible for $50 off a Casa node, which includes the gold subscription. You can get $200 off your first year Casa Platinum with 3 or 5 key shield multi-sig, or $500 off first year of Casa Diamond with 3 or 5 key shield and full team support. Neither Casa nor BlockFi are earning profits directly from this partnership. Instead, they're passing it all on to you, the clients. So if you're interested in checking that out, make sure you head over to blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. That is blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. Okay, so on to the interview, and this one was a pretty quick turnaround. Michel is someone I've known, and I've met her at a few conferences recently. We were on the same panel at the Value of Bitcoin conference in Munich. It was totally cool to get to know him. And when I saw that they had released the Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index last week, I wanted to get him on straight away. So I reached out to him. I said, come on, Michel, come on the show. And he agreed. So, Bitcoin energy consumption. Is it boiling the oceans? Are we killing baby polar bears by sending Bitcoin to each other? I don't think so, right? How often are you hearing this FUD alongside things like Bitcoin uses more electricity than the Ukraine or more than Switzerland and all this kind of nonsense where people are trying to use Bitcoin's energy consumption as a reason not to use it? Is there any justification for this argument? I mean, I don't think it is. And that's why I wanted to get Michel on the show and discuss this with him. So, yeah, this gets pretty high level at times. Some of the things I asked him, I was wrong. I'd made some assumptions that were wrong. But Michel comes across as a totally fair person. His attitude is totally fair. He's on point with all the things I raised to him. And he also raises some interesting questions like, does Bitcoin need to be inefficient to work? And what would happen if Bitcoin was to hit $1 million? Would it use all the energy on the earth and destroy the planet? Okay, so I know this is important to Bitcoiners, so I think you're going to enjoy this. If you've got any questions about it, you can always hit me up. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. And just to note, I'm out in LA at the moment. I've been here in the States again for about a week. I did some interviews in New York. I did one in Chicago. I'm headed down to San Diego tomorrow. Then it's going to be back to LA. Then I'm going to be off to San Francisco, New York, and home. So racking up the miles, but getting all the interviews in. I'm going to be taking an extended holiday in August. Need a break. Need to spend some time with my kids. So I'm racking up the interviews so they're all ready for when I'm away. Anyway, if you want to support the show, head over to my website. It's whatbitcoindid.com. Click on the sports section. Loads of things you can do. And I also just want to say a massive thanks to my Patreon top tier sponsor, Vidyen, makers of vidhash.com, where demonetized YouTube content creators can earn Monero, which you can then sell for Bitcoin. when fans watch via their web mining links. That is vidhash.com, which is vidhash.com. Anyway, onto the interview. And as I said, if you got any questions, feel free to hit me up. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Well, how are you, Michel?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. We keep bumping into each other at conferences now, don't we?
Yeah, we kind of like seem to bump into each other all the time. So yeah, it's been quite fun.
Yeah. What did you make of Munich?
So Munich, I was presenting at the Value of Bitcoin conference, and so yeah, we essentially ended up being on the same panel. You as a moderator, and with Alex de Vries and Dan Held. In the end, I think both of us were kind of like more casual bystanders, just watching the two debating. But it was quite a lot of fun.
What did you make of the whole event, though? Because it was kind of that bringing together of bankers and Bitcoiners, and the bankers still seemed quite resistant.
I have to say, I was actually quite surprised how open they seem to be honest. So I've been to other events like this pretty much 2-3 years ago, and the atmosphere was genuinely completely different. It's not sure how to actually explain it, but it seems like Bitcoin's here to stay, and they've recognized it. And so now it's really about kind of like, furthering the understanding and see, okay, so what could we do with this? Because this is not, it doesn't seem to be going away. So I found that quite interesting to actually observe that.
Yeah, what I found in the breakout sessions when we were grabbing lunch and grabbing a coffee, people were very open-minded and kind of, like you say, accepting. But I felt during the debates, maybe there was more resistance, but perhaps that maybe was the louder voices.
Yeah, I think so. Well, on both sides, to be fair, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for example, safety, just like jumping up and so on. So, but I actually thought it was pretty civilized, to be honest. And of course, when they're on stage, they have to, to kind of like support their official position, which is still pretty, let's say, conservative for most institutions. But even given that, I think it was actually fairly balanced and interesting. So.
And we had a good debate about energy consumption, as you said. But as you noted, we were the bystanders, really. I think Alex is obviously very entrenched in his views, and Dan is a staunch defender of Bitcoin. So I think those two went to war, and you and I we got to watch it. But I did try and include you.
Thanks for the try.
All right, man. So before we get into the recent announcement, for people who don't know you, it would be good if you can just give a background, explain the work that you do at the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance.
Sure. So I'm a researcher at the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance, which is a research centre based at Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. And so I joined the centre about 3 years ago to essentially launch their cryptocurrency and blockchain research together with Dr. Gary Heilman back then. And I've been leading that research program since 2 years now. And so the key research that we do is really mostly empirical benchmarking studies. So we reach out to companies and institutions in the space. So it could be exchanges, miners, wallet service providers, and so on. But also institutions like central banks and public sector institutions. And then we get or collect data directly from them, which we then combine with the wealth of public information that's available to essentially provide really an empirical picture of where the industry is at and where it's heading.
But the centre doesn't just focus on cryptocurrencies, right?
No, so we've got a larger team and we focus on 4 key areas. So besides cryptocurrency and blockchains, it's all started with crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending. So that's really when the center launched in 2015. That was really the key focus. And since then, we've actually evolved to essentially include other types of alternative finance. And so alternative finance, to us, we really define it as any sort of system, channel or instrument that really emerges outside of traditional finance. And that is a sector that has really exploded in recent years. So it's quite a lot of research to do.
Especially because of cryptocurrencies? Is that a dominant part of the work now?
No, I would just say it's one of several verticals. So just to give you like an orders of magnitude comparison. So for example, when we do these benchmarking studies, we generally have around 300 to 400 entities that we study in the cryptocurrency ecosystem. Whereas our colleagues from the alternative finance benchmarking, so mostly crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, they've surveyed, I think, thousands of platforms in China alone. So it gives you just like a bit of an idea of the scale. But eventually we hope to get to similar numbers as well for the cryptocurrency research.
And how much of a focus is there on Bitcoin versus alternative cryptocurrencies? Are you completely neutral as a organization, or do you have any bias or focus?
Well, as an academic institution, we're supposed to be independent and unbiased, right? So we can't really have any preferences towards a given asset. So we just look at the numbers. And so, yeah, we don't discriminate against any cryptocurrency or crypto assets, whatever you want to call them. Now, it just turns out that Bitcoin is actually still the most used, most dominant cryptocurrency. So it always comes back. And you've got probably around 5 to 6 more that the service providers that we survey are always mentioning. And that's pretty much it. All the rest is really the long tail that, for us, to be honest, doesn't really yield much interest or much, there's not much interest from our side to actually do more research on that because they're just not really being used at all.
Right, so you're not studying Dentacoin?
No, not directly.
All right, man. Well, so energy consumption is a massive area. You obviously had an announcement. Was it last week now?
Yeah, it was pretty much exactly one week ago, so Tuesday last week.
Okay, and energy consumption is a hot topic within Bitcoin. It's a nice focal point for the haters to throw shade over Bitcoin. So you stated it quite nicely. I think I might have been in your tweet storm, but you brought it down to 2 points. Like, Bitcoin mining boils the oceans and directly contributes to climate change, and B, Bitcoin is the most efficient money ever devised and will drive the green revolution. And then you nicely put that the debate lacks nuance.
Yeah, I kind of just want to summarize really both extreme sides of that debate, just to show that there's like a big gap in the middle. And of course, this has been a gross oversimplification. Of course, there's like more balanced voices. But I just like to kind of show how far those two positions are actually, or how diametrically opposed they are. And that as a result, you've got you get essentially all these different headlines that either support the argument that Bitcoin is directly contributing to climate change, or on the other hand, that's mostly Bitcoin supporters who actually say, no, it's going to drive the green revolution, which frankly, I think, at least right now, is also far-fetched to say.
Well, what you tend to find, though, is when Bitcoin hits mainstream media, it tends to be something along the energy consumption. It always compares it to a country. Which country have we reached? There's almost like two measures. There's price, and then the country we can compare energy consumption to. And what you're going to have is a bunch of people who've maybe heard of Bitcoin, probably have never owned it, think of it as magic internet money, and hear that it uses as much energy as Switzerland to make a few people rich. And it's kind of misleading.
It is. And the thing is, let's say it's essentially about two main things, right? And so we also are guilty of this because we also do a country comparison, but that's one of several comparisons that we do. And essentially the main reason why we do it is that, so according to our model right now, Bitcoin consumes around 60 terawatt hours a year on an annualized basis. Now, the thing is, to most people, that doesn't really mean anything. And frankly, before I start with this research, like 60 terawatt hours, I have absolutely no clue. Is that like a lot? Is it not a lot? And then, well, the first natural thing to do is to look for a benchmark, right? So something to compare it to. Now, the problem with countries, obviously, if it consumes as much as Switzerland or any other country, that just sounds enormous. So what we also do on our website is that just after that country comparison, we also compare it against the major countries. And there you basically can't even see Bitcoin because it's just like a minor blip on the chart as compared to China, the US, and India. So it's the idea really is to first put that figure, so that 60 terawatt hour figure, into perspective so that people can make up their own essentially mind in terms of like, where does that actually sit? So put it into perspective. Now, this is different from actually suggesting that it is a good thing that Bitcoin consumes as much energy as a country, because that is more something of, a cost-benefit analysis that you need to do. And for that, you also need to objectively evaluate what the benefits actually are. So what is the utility derived from users by just using Bitcoin the system or Bitcoin the unit? Now, that is a completely different type of exercise that we essentially don't want to go into right now, because it just requires a lot more deeper analysis about how Bitcoin is being used and the exact utility that people all over the world get from using it in a specific given situation. And because that's mostly contextual, it's very difficult to generalize.
Of course, it's quite subjective because a lot of people will state that holding Bitcoin is using Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I would actually agree with that, right? If you consider it to be a sort of synthetic commodity money, as George Selgin puts it, and that is being used as a store value, so long-term essentially financial investment, sure, then holding it is definitely a use case. Now, others like, Bitcoin Cash supporters would probably disagree and say, no, it's primarily for payments, which is also a fair point to say. And the thing is, Bitcoin, the network, doesn't really care what you use it for. And that's what I personally, as a researcher, find so interesting about it. As long as you just comply with the protocol rules and pay a fee so that miners will essentially include your transaction into a block, well, you can use it for whatever you like. And nobody can prevent you from doing that.
Yeah, this is where Dan Held would chip in and say, is the trustless settlement of $1.34 trillion between counterparties annually with the added benefit of cheaper energy for all worth the $4.5 billion in mining costs? He makes a very solid argument that to have a trustless network, a secure trustless network, which is allowing value transfer across the world, is worth the cost. He would absolutely state it. One thing I would ask you, though, have you done any work to look at almost the cost per user in the network? So, for example, you can look at how much energy that maybe the airline industry uses, but then you could also then compare that to the number of people who fly.
Sure, but for that you would first need to have an accurate measure of how many users there actually are. And
you'd have to do an estimate just to give some kind of ballpark figure. I think we know there's something like 50 million addresses, say. And is that about right?
I haven't looked at the addresses, but I don't think that's actually a really good measure because you've got all these large custodial service providers that have all money. But so what we did is we reached out to service providers, and so we found that there are around 35 million ID verified users at different exchanges and wallet service providers. And so if you add that to all those that are probably not, so essentially self-custodying their coins, we would also estimate it's between 30 and 50 million Bitcoin users right now. But again, this is a very rough estimate. Now, the thing is, in terms of like the costs per user, it depends on what exactly you're doing, right? And then we're back again to what can you use Bitcoin for? You can use it to do small value payments like paying for coffee, and actually people are increasingly doing that with Lightning now. But you can also use it as a hodler. So essentially as a financial investment. Then you can also use it to do cross-border payments or the payments that actually others wouldn't let you do. So the payments you can't do on Visa or MasterCard. But then you can also use it as a public notary. So essentially time-stamping documents to do proof of existence, so verifying the existence and also integrity of a document at some point of time, of time. And the thing is, these are already 4 completely different use cases that have 4 different types of users, and of course also require different, essentially, transaction sizes depending on what you do. And that is really where fees are being determined, right? So how large is your transaction? Now, the thing is, this makes it actually very difficult to just like generalize it and boil it down to, this is the cost per user, because each of these users use it for completely different purposes. And some might actually bring higher utility to the users than, let's say, just using Bitcoin for fun to pay for coffee just to demonstrate that it works.
So essentially, we have a free market for the use of Bitcoin and we have a free market for energy. So why do we even care?
Well, I wouldn't say that we shouldn't care at all, but I think that, the system is kind of self-regulating in a sense. So even if you have some examples of, let's say, regional governments that try to create disincentives for miners to actually stay there, so essentially want to drive them out by either, cutting subsidies, raising taxes, and so on, well, what happens is that miners will just naturally leave to another place where essentially you've got low-cost electricity in high abundance, and that's fine. So it's like a free market. Now, the thing is, if every government at the same time would start enacting restrictive measures regarding mining, that would create quite a lot of problems. And so this is one of the main reasons why we actually wanted to launch this project, so the Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index, because we talk quite a lot to regulators and policymakers, so both in terms of just education, to be honest, so educating them about different things, but then also in terms of advising them on some of the policies that they can enact. And so one topic that always comes up is really, so how much energy does Bitcoin consume and what does that do to first environment, but second also to our local economy, so households and potential industries that might get displaced by Bitcoin miners. And so there seems to be really a lot of misconceptions and also many questions and doubts, and I would say legitimate doubts that haven't really been resolved so far and clarified. And so unless there is really one reliable measure that provides an unbiased overview over, first, how much Bitcoin actually consumes in terms of electricity, but then more importantly, and that's the second part of our project, what is Bitcoin's environmental footprint? So what does it actually mean for the climate? Because you can burn 1 kilowatt hour, or you can burn coal to produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, which has completely different environmental footprint than just using hydropower to produce that same amount of electricity. And that hydropower would essentially just, go wasted because there is no grids to actually transport it over long distances or no way to store it over some period of time. So I think doing that analysis will alleviate lots of the concerns that lots of regulators and policymakers have, and that might prevent them then from taking too restrictive measures that they might have taken otherwise based on, sparse or incorrect information.
Right, so you're thinking in terms of regulators who are under increasing pressure to reduce energy consumption. I think the UK is now set a target of being, carbon neutral by, say, 2050. They have to consider things such as Bitcoin mining. And if they have this misconception that Bitcoin miners are using fossil fuels as opposed to renewable fuels, they might actually put the wrong kind of tariffs and taxes on it.
Yeah, exactly. And in some cases that might be warranted, given the local, situation. So if Bitcoin miners actually displace other industries that provide also utility to the region, just because they're competing for that electricity that's there, then you need to consider, again, do a cost-benefit analysis. So what do we actually get from Bitcoin mining, and is it worth that it displaces these other industries? And so for that, we would probably need some more studies. But as far as I can see right now, this really hasn't happened in a lot of places, so it's not like an immediate concern. But it's still something that policymakers and regulators, are essentially required to look at. And then you've got, of course, politicians, always driven by, short-term,
career goals.
Exactly, which is also totally understandable. And so, exactly as you mentioned, then you have these headlines saying that, Bitcoin money for criminals consumes as much electricity as a country like Switzerland. Well, that's quite an easy target then for at least short-term measures. Whether in the future that really, brings you a lot, I would doubt it. But in the short term. And so our goal is really with this website, to provide an unbiased estimate of how much it consumes. And then in a second phase, really go deeper into the really environmental footprint discussion to actually really quantify what Bitcoin's impact on the climate actually is.
So you can really stack up the FUD then. You can say that we are boiling the oceans and killing polar bears to help finance terrorists.
You could say that, yeah. Probably someone has already said.
There were a number of other tools out there. So why did you decide to create your own one? I mean, Alex DeFries has his own one, the Bitcoin Energy Consumption Index. Why another one?
Right. So essentially, you mentioned pretty much the only alternative right now that is also based on a real-time model, and that is essentially updated I don't know how often he updates it, but at least on a daily basis, I would say. But apart from that, you've just had a few studies, but generally they use different methodologies, and they essentially just provide a one-time snapshot. And given that price plus hash rate functions quite volatile, so that is not very helpful. So we figured then there needs to be a real-time model for that. Now, looking at Alex DeVries' model, I think it's an interesting approach. So it's a top-down model that actually looks at estimating miner revenues, and then using an assumption that says, they use X% of the mining revenues are spent on essentially just electricity. So to cover electricity costs. And I think right now he uses 60% for that. And then he goes on to find an average kilowatt hour price globally. And from there, he essentially calculates the estimated energy usage. So that's an economic top-down model. So our model is based on an approach developed by Mark Bevans in a blog post in, I think, early 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And so that is a bottom-up approach. So it's also based on economic factors, but it starts really with the actual hardware, so the mining equipment that exists, and then tries to build in some assumptions in terms of who is using what equipment at what time, and then using the mining equipment efficiencies, so essentially their specs, we do a bottom-up analysis. So I can go into details how that exactly works, if you like.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd like to know a bit more about like the theoretical upper bound and the theoretical lower bound as well, because there's quite a range in there.
Yeah. And so as you mentioned, we added theoretical just 2 days after, because we noticed that the big gap between those two bounds was actually causing quite a lot of confusion. And of course, people don't read the methodology. So we just want to make it absolutely clear that this is just an absolutely purely theoretical, floor and ceiling.
Well, the methodology is quite detailed as well. So I read through it this morning, and it isn't a case of you can just read it and okay, I instantly get this. You almost need to sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and go through it just to... I could probably spend a day just trying to get my head around the model. And like you say, most people aren't going to do that. They're just going to look at the number and go, here's my conclusion.
Which is absolutely fine, but I think adding the word theoretical hopefully clarifies some of this. But so speaking about the theoretical, the lower bound is probably the easiest to calculate. So that is really based on a very simplistic assumption, which is also very unrealistic, hence the theoretical nature of it. And that just assumes that all miners always use the most efficient hardware that's available on the market. And so just by doing that, you just essentially need to have the hash rate, and that's it. So you just calculate the hash rate using the most efficient equipment out there, and that's how you get to this absolute floor in terms of how much electricity Bitcoin would consume if everybody used the most efficient hardware. Now, that is very unrealistic because, of course, for a lot of different reasons, not all miners use the same equipment, and they may also have, or actually in many cases, still have some old equipment that, depending on the Bitcoin price and on the current hash rate, might still be profitable to actually mine. And so for that, then you can do the same approach, or use the same approach for an upper bound. So really to provide a ceiling to this essentially boundary. And for that, you then assume that all miners always use the least efficient hardware. Now, the thing is, of course, you could take that to the extreme and say, well, if everybody used a CPU, where would we be? Now, the thing is that you quickly get really to a figure that consumes more electricity than the Earth actually produces. So that is not a very, reliable or useful ceiling either. So the thing is, what we did, and that's essentially based on Mark Bevan's initial idea, is that then we take all the equipment that exists. So essentially we have a list of more than 60 different ASICs. And then we model the economic lifetime of each of these. So just in terms of mining revenues minus the electricity costs. So leaving out or aside all other operational costs like maintenance and so on, as well as any capital expenditures. And so we model the economic lifetime of each of that equipment just to see so at any given point in time, and we do the model since 2014, so November 2014. So any of these days, when is a given equipment still profitable given the Bitcoin price and the hash rate? And then we assume from that, well, we just use the least efficient hardware that is available on the market, but still profitable, at least in electricity terms, purely. And so, of course, that changes pretty much every other day because Bitcoin price and hash rate is quite volatile. But so that's how you get to this theoretical upper bound. Now, because hash rate often lags a bit behind price, so if you have, like recently, the last 2 weeks, Bitcoin price is spiking, then that doesn't necessarily immediately translate into a higher hash rate. So difficulty stays the same, which then means that mining revenues are a lot higher than they used to be, given a constant hash rate. And that also means that a lot of previously unprofitable hardware now becomes profitable again. So assuming that
comes back online.
Exactly. And this is why this range, as soon as Bitcoin prices really spike, you see really the upper bound figure just like skyrockets completely. But then again, that's also a quite, unrealistic assumption because lots of miners use the latest generation hardware and the most efficient ones. So this is also just a purely theoretical ceiling, essentially.
Right. So in some ways, the trend is probably more important than the actual numbers because you can't get to the actual numbers. So it's more like you start to follow the trend.
I wouldn't really necessarily say it's really a trend. It's really the main reason we put those two numbers there is just to delineate the boundaries really of the estimate.
Right.
So you could say, well, it's very, very unrealistic that Bitcoin consumes at a total more than this particular upper bound figure. So just going to the index right now, how much is it? So it's a very, very high number. So in terms of power, it's 25 gigawatts power capacities, which would translate into 186 terawatt hours a year, which is just enormous, but also completely unrealistic. Yeah.
I still feel like when following the charts, the trend kind of follows the price, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it was like when we were in Munich, like Alex's point, which I think was slightly misleading, but when he started to predict future value of the Bitcoin network, if it was to be worth trillions, then what would the impact then be on hash rate and therefore power consumption? So
the thing is, we purposefully don't include any predictions because I just don't think you can predict either the Bitcoin price or Bitcoin's hash rates in the future, and that is essentially the two main dynamic parameters that go into the model. Now, what you could do, so what he essentially did is more like a thought experiment, which essentially says that, okay, according to my economic model, there is always an equilibrium. So if price goes up, mining revenues goes up, my model assumes that also the hash rate will automatically go up, so that in equilibrium, marginal revenues equal marginal costs. So that essentially there is no benefit or no profit can be made anymore because the market is so efficient, so that it will always get to this equilibrium. And then, of course, using that particular logic, then if the Bitcoin price goes up to 1 million, then there will be an equilibrium, which essentially then means that Bitcoin will just consume pretty much the entire energy produced on the planet. How likely that is, I'm not exactly sure. But I think still, trend-wise, it's not totally unreasonable to expect something like this. Just because for miners, as long as it's profitable to mine, they will just add more hash rate. Now, there's practical limitations to that, right? How much electricity do you have access to? What are the electricity costs? And especially also hardware equipment, right? Like ASICs don't just grow on trees, so they need to be manufactured, produced, shipped, which, of course, causes significant delays and lags in between. So that's also things to consider. But overall, I think that if the Bitcoin price rises, then the electricity consumption will automatically rise as well, necessarily.
Yeah, and I guess over a long enough time frame with innovation in ASICs, as the machines become more efficient, you could see an increase in hash rate, but with a lower proportional increase in energy consumption.
I'm not so sure about this. And the reason for that is really that over time, so the thing is Bitcoin needs to be inefficient, right? So in order to work, it needs to be inefficient and it needs to have high costs in order to add new blocks, which also means it needs to be very expensive to change past blocks. And as ASICs really get commoditized, so essentially in terms of acquiring them, really that cost over time will really drop significantly, and it has already dropped significantly. Then that means the over time, so long time horizon, the only essentially cost that will remain, like the substantial cost, will be electricity costs. And so even if ASICs get more energy efficient, that will just mean that people will buy more ASICs because there needs to be a source of, a cost that needs to be there. And it trends towards being electricity costs being really by far the main cost driver.
Right.
And if that doesn't work anymore, well, then there's no incentive to essentially secure Bitcoin. And then, yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Next up, I talked to Michel more about the Cambridge Energy Consumption Index, but before that, I got a message from my amazing sponsors. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to talk to you about Cointing. They've been sponsoring the show for a while. Have you checked them out yet? Are you taking your tax seriously? If you're making some gains, you need to be. It is easily the best crypto tax calculator in the market. I've had a look. All the others are rubbish. So don't look at them. Just go and use a Cointing. One of the things I've really liked about this company is their speed of innovation, how fast they are updating the tool. And today they gave me a sneak peek preview of their updated dashboard, which is going to be released next week. It's a really cool update. Not only is a Cointing a tax tool, but it allows you to manage your portfolio. It allows you to easily compare the performance of your portfolio to the market, and it's got a whole bunch of data about the coins you've bought, the prices you bought them at, and where they're stored. They've got price charts, portfolio ratios, and so much more. You're definitely going to want to check this out, especially with the update next week. And also, they've got an app coming soon, so you'll be able to manage your portfolio on the move. And as I said, it is the best price tax tool on the market, and you only pay at the point you want to export your tax report. It's pretty cool, really. So if you're taking your tax seriously, you need to check out Accointing. Do this at accointing.com, which is accointing.com. That is accointing.com, which is accointing.com. And lastly, this week, and never least with any of my sponsors, is Dropbit, especially Dropbit. Love these guys, so much support for the show. and they have the most badass mobile Bitcoin wallet available in the App Store, bar none. So many cool features. You can text Bitcoin to people. You can tweet Bitcoin to people. I did it this morning. Some dude just reached out to me on Twitter and said, send me some Bitcoin. Send me some drop bit Bitcoin. So I did. Send him $25. There you go. But why should you check it out? It's like a Venmo for Bitcoin. It's just the easiest way to send and release Bitcoin. It's actually changed the way I use Bitcoin. I load up my wallet now when I'm traveling with a few sats. So if I need any Bitcoin when I'm on the move, I've got Bitcoin. I don't have to go around with my hardware wallets worrying that someone's going to attack me and chop my head off and try and take my Bitcoin. But have you checked it out yet? Have you downloaded it? Come on, you need to. These guys are smashing it. I know a bunch of people have downloaded it. I've got so much feedback. People love it. It's got so many exciting things coming up soon. I'm talking to the team regularly. You know, if I've got feedback on it, they listen, which is super cool. Love having a sponsor like that. So come on, check out Dropbit. It's available for the iPhone and Android. You can find out more at dropbit.app, which is dropbit.app. That's dropbit.app, which is dropbit.app. Did you do any work looking at the number of transactions? Because I know, again, going back to Alex DeFree's Bitcoin Energy Consumption Index, the comparison was about, from my calculation, that one Bitcoin transaction equals around 350,000 Visa transactions. Now, I don't think that is a fair comparison, but they still did the work.
Yeah, so that's again the main problem about comparing Bitcoin to something else, right? So we also compare it to countries, for example, which frankly doesn't really make much sense. It's more about putting things into perspective. Now, of course, just to put things into perspective, you can compare it to a payment system like Visa. But then you need to be clear that those serve completely different value propositions. So it's really just about putting the figure into perspective, but not suggesting that Bitcoin does exactly the same thing as Visa, and therefore it just is 1,000 or 100,000 times less efficient, which means that Visa is the best alternative. This is kind of like my reading, at least when I go to that website, and this is something that essentially we wanted to change on our website. But some of the feedback we actually got is that right now we do similar comparisons, and it doesn't become immediately clear that we essentially just want to put figures into perspective. So we're really planning to essentially split that comparison section into two. So first having something to put figures into perspective, but then a second section about alternative uses, you know, for things that tend to use or produce a similar value proposition as Bitcoin, using those four different essentially use cases that exist, and then directly comparing those to essentially Bitcoin's electricity consumption, but also using things like, you know, untapped hydro sources that are in remote regions that can't be easily accessed and essentially go wasted right now. And so comparing how much of that particular electricity could essentially power Bitcoin without causing any interruption or disruption to existing industries or other uses. So I think it's worth splitting those things up, and generally in comparisons they tend to get conflated, which creates a lot of confusion and I would say wrong or misperceptions about what Bitcoin actually does.
Yeah, so another issue I have with the comparison to the Visa transactions is that I believe that the energy consumption secures the Bitcoin network. And to only compare it to base chain transactions is quite misleading because it doesn't take into consideration off-chain transactions and layer 2 transactions, which will obviously be a much higher number if you calculated them all. They're not taken into consideration. Therefore, it just feels a little bit, I don't know, unfair.
Yeah, exactly. And also the thing is Bitcoin, so the throughput of the Bitcoin network, so the number of transactions is completely unrelated to the electricity that's being used by the network. Those are two completely separate things. But doing that comparison actually suggests that they are very closely linked, which means that people think that, okay, if Bitcoin now were to process not 4 or 5 transactions a second, but 1,000, that means that the electricity consumption will just jump up by a factor of 1,000 as well, or 500, which is not correct because those two are completely unrelated. But then also, as you mentioned, one transaction can actually hide different semantics. So you can, for example, timestamp billions of documents using standards like Open Timestamp, for example, to do proof of existence. That won't really be noticeable by anyone just looking at the upper return field. But yeah, as you mentioned as well, there's off-chain transactions or payments. Well, even one single transaction can have multiple payments, right? So you have one company that essentially pays out, let's say, a mining pool that pays out the different hashers using one transaction, but there's hundreds of payments in there. And another argument essentially for saying why the energy cost per transaction doesn't really make much sense, the metric, is I think it comes from Lawrence MT, that's his Twitter name, that every transaction, or every proof of work essentially secures the entire chain, right? So every past transaction. So with every additional block, you get another layer of security on top, which secures all the UTXOs that are in previous blocks. And so this is also something that in traditional payment systems, we don't really see, because it's something that doesn't really exist in there. So this is also a factor to take into account, yes.
Right, okay. So listen, what is the carbon footprint of Bitcoin? Is it something we should be concerned about?
So that's something that we purposefully left out at this stage, just because we do not have enough data on that. And the reason it goes back to what I was saying before is that you can burn coal to produce 1 kilowatt hour, which is fundamentally different from using hydro or any other type of renewables to produce the same amount of electricity. Now, in order to estimate or quantify Bitcoin's environmental footprint, so the carbon emission or carbon dioxide emissions, you would need to actually know exactly the energy sources, so the energy mix of each hashing facility to actually get to an, let's say, reasonable estimation. Now, obviously, this is pretty much impossible because we actually don't know how many hashing facilities there are, where they are based, what energy sources they use. But that would be really the only, I would say, accurate way to do that. Now, there's been, of course, lots of different estimates from some other academics, but Alex de Vries does it as well. And there was actually a pretty good paper recently by the University of Technical University of Munich, who also attempted to do this by actually just looking at pool locations and IP addresses of mining equipment that were connecting to those pools. Now, there's quite a few issues with that approach, but it was still an interesting methodology I haven't really seen before. So Alex de Vries, I think he estimates it by just looking at, for example, one of the mining maps that we produced, and then essentially extrapolating from that where miners are based, and then looking at the yearly or annual statistical yearbooks of in that given region, let's say in a Chinese region like in Mongolia, what is the average electricity mix or energy mix? And there it happens to be mostly coal, and then that gets extrapolated to essentially get to a global carbon emission figure. The problem with that approach is really that what we can see in practice is that most miners are essentially off the grid. So they are mostly really based in very remote areas that essentially, are completely off the grid. So you can't really store electricity for a long time, you can't transport it over long distances, and they have special electricity deals with the local power stations. And it often happens that those power stations are in remote areas where there is an excess in renewables, mostly hydropower. But of course, that doesn't appear on the grid. So if you just use the grid's figures to extrapolate, then you won't get to those figures either. And the problem is, in my opinion, the most recent estimates, they don't really take this factor into account. And as a result, they overestimate carbon emissions.
Right.
But again, to really empirically prove that, you would essentially need to do a bottom-up analysis by really going through the hashing facilities, getting the exact energy mix, and then extrapolating from that.
That sounds too big a task. It's almost impractical to do.
Well, of course, you can always approximate it, right? So yeah, you never get to the exact figure. But so this is part of the second stage of our project, where we want essentially build on our mining map that we had in our last report, so the second global benchmarking study, where we already identified around 120 different hashing facilities all over the world. And for some of them, they're actually very open about their energy mix. And so we essentially plan to make that map available on that website, so make it an interactive version, and actually collaborate together with miners and power stations to essentially maintain that list on an ongoing basis. So at an aggregate level, so not the really individual locations, because we don't want to be responsible for any miners getting, their equipment seized or, doing things that would run counter their OPSEC. So we want to do it on an aggregate level, so mostly region-based, which would still give us enough information to actually do not only then an approximate carbon estimation, but also would enable us to essentially get more information about how centralized mining actually is, both in geographical terms, but also in terms of how many operators there are, how many facilities do they operate. So it would actually give us a lot more information about the health of the Bitcoin network and the security of the Bitcoin network as well, as a kind of like nice byproduct.
Have you taken a look at the CoinShares report? Where I think they estimated it was around 77% was from renewables.
Yeah, I have to say, personally, I find that number to be very high. Like, I was very surprised to actually hear that figure. But interesting, so I'm going to have actually a call with the one of the co-authors, essentially tomorrow, to discuss this and see how we could potentially collaborate and just like so we understand better what their methodology is. So just using our own data that we got by talking directly to hashing facilities, it's more about in the 20 to 30% range. So there's quite a big gap between those two figures. And frankly, I personally have no idea which figure is closer to the actual, reality. I would say it's probably something in the middle. But so
maybe about 50% then.
Exactly. So right now it's really two estimates that have a very huge gap in between. So it's a bit like the lower bound and upper bound for the index itself.
Well, whilst we have a lot of FUD, we do have a history of Bitcoiners tending to either post-rationalize criticisms or go with the most positive news possible. So I've heard many Bitcoiners respond to the energy consumption potential FUD, depends how you look at it, because I think it's subjective, and bring out the CoinShares statistic, 77% is renewable. So obviously that's potentially misleading itself.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly that lack of nuance in the debate from those two extremist sides. And let's say some mainstream economists and commentators in the news do exactly the same thing, but just using the other side, right? So saying, Bitcoin mining is powered by 60 or 70% of coal in China, which is just devastating for the environment. And frankly, I think that figure is just as far away from the reality than a 70 plus share of renewables. And with all due respect to the CoinShares report, so I don't want to, say that their numbers are completely wrong. It just personally, to me, seems very high, given the conversations that we have with some miners. And just the fact that renewables are intermittent in nature, most of them, right? So even if, like during the wet season, miners actually move in China to Sichuan and other provinces, just because, the dams are just full. So there's lots of abundant hydropower. But in the dry season, that essentially dries completely up. So they need to go back to coal or to other fossil fuels. So it's also seasonal. And so if you have like a general renewables figure, I think that needs to take into account both seasons, right?
Do you think that Bitcoin gets a disproportionate amount of attention for energy consumption? Because one of the really interesting things on your website, because I didn't know this, if somebody asked me, I'd have my suspicions, but idle home devices in the US could bow Bitcoin for 3 years. That's just idle home devices. And then the other thing I noticed, particularly recently, is like if I'm coming into a city late at night, the amount of office blocks which are just lit up, where those rooms are empty. So you've got idle home devices, but I'm assuming globally there is a huge amount of energy waste.
Oh, exactly. And that was the main reason, essentially, on that comparison page. We don't want to do any value judgment ourselves. We just want to provide, a neutral platform for visitors, essentially, to make up their own mind in terms of, is that now a lot of electricity or not? And for that, you need to present both sides of the debate as well, using examples to illustrate that. And so going back to the country example, that's something that's been used quite a lot by the media to essentially demonize Bitcoin. But then on the other hand, we also wanted to show, there's actually a lot of ways, as you just mentioned, in conventional ways of using electricity that could power the Bitcoin network for quite a long amount of time, or at least multiple times, given the daily consumption. And so providing both sides of that debate, I think, is very important to bring some balance to the debate as well, because both supporters as well as critics generally tend to use the comparisons that, suit their narratives or fit their narratives. And that doesn't really contribute to a healthy debate either.
Right, okay. So that is really interesting, and probably get a kick from the Bitcoiners for saying this. But, I do have a slight concern over energy usage of Bitcoin. How much security is enough? But I know you can't put a limit on it because as the network grows, it is a market. The miners will buy more equipment and they will put more online as long as they can make money from it. But I do think we get to a point where surely there is enough security. I just don't see anywhere limiting it. And I'm not very keen on Alex DeFree's suggestion that we should move Bitcoin to proof of stake either.
No, so that's also something that actually lots of, well, I wouldn't say necessarily academics, but let's say researchers in general always suggest that proof of stake is just, orders of magnitude more environmentally friendly. So it has proven itself. So let's switch to that and would solve all our problems. Now, the thing is, this really assumes that proof of stake has the same security assumptions and the same security levels than proof of work. And right now, there's absolutely no evidence to support that claim. Now, I personally, if essentially it turned out to have the same security guarantees, I think we should always use the most efficient way of doing things if all else is equal. But right now, frankly, there is no evidence that supports that claim, which means that proof of work still remains the most trust-minimized essentially way of essentially reaching consensus on a global level, where you don't need to have parties participating in a consensus process that need to be identified.
Okay, that's pretty compelling. I think that's one of the other problems I'm probably going to sound very mean towards Alex, but I think one of the problems I have is that I guess your tool and your study and your approach is very neutral. You said it's very neutral. You've recognized both extremes of the debate and you think there's more nuance to this. But I feel like maybe with the work that Alex is doing, he's coming from a little bit more anti-Bitcoin energy consumption, less anti-Bitcoin, and it feels there's maybe more of a bias in the work he's doing. And I felt that actually at the debate too.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. I don't want to get into
You don't want to get into that. Okay, well, I'll say it from my side.
I have a huge deal of respect for Alex, for what he's done. So for essentially having built the first real-time index, I think his approach is really interesting because it's just a fundamentally different methodology. And as he recently mentioned, so he benchmarked our best guess estimate compared to his one. And essentially the figures are not really that much different. So there's like a 20-30% gap, which I think is very reasonable for essentially two fundamentally different methodologies. Now, in terms of the way he maybe presents some of the findings, I agree that I had a long discussion in Munich with him in person about using these, energy cost per transaction metrics or comparing it to households, because those are two completely different things. So the energy that's being used by Bitcoin could not power, let's say, a few million US households, just very simply because that electricity or that energy is in very remote regions in different parts of the world. So it could never power US households. So in that regard, it's not a very good comparison either. But on the other hand, I accept the criticism that he essentially made on our index and the comparisons, that essentially those comparisons are not a lot better than his, because they don't really compare apples to apples. And I think that's also a fair point to actually say. And so this is why we really want to split up those comparison pages into things, just putting it into perspective by presenting both sides and make it look large or small, depending on what side you're on to debate. But also then having a separate side where we really try to compare likes for likes. So essentially Bitcoin to, gold production or something like that, because I really consider it to be more store value as well. Or also to other waste of electricity that could essentially be used for different things. But yeah, so that is going to be in a second version of our project.
What's the general feedback been from the tool then?
I have to say we've really been overwhelmed. So it's been It's been very good, especially the first 2 days. I think it's been the tweet, the thread that I did on Twitter was probably my most popular thread ever. And also just lots of media interest, also from mainstream journals and mainstream news sites, but especially, of course, the cryptocurrency community. So yeah, we've received tons of messages on Twitter. Also, a lot of people actually bothered to really have a look at the methodology and get back to us via the contact form on our website, providing suggestions, comments, feedback, and so on. So no, it's been really great so far.
Yeah, and I'll share that out on the show notes because I did find reading through the methodology quite interesting. It was, I mean, how much work went into this? You must have been working on this for quite some time.
Yeah, so we're actually a very small team. So we've been 3 people working on this, and not even full-time because we also have other research projects going on.
Yeah, of course.
But it's been probably in the making for like 2 to 3 months. And then again, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, to quote Isaac Newton, in the sense that we didn't really come up with that methodology ourselves, right? So we were looking at all the previous estimates that existed, combining all these different methodologies together, and then really, picking the best practices. So essentially, the main methodology was really developed by Mark Bevent. And so, credit where credit is due. So,
and you've alluded to some things coming soon in the future. So what can you tell us? What's coming when? What should we keep an eye out for?
So I don't want to give any precise timelines because, again, we're in lots of different research projects. So I don't want to create, too high expectations here. But so I think the first thing we're going to add is really splitting that comparison page to provide a fairer comparison, because I think some of the criticism we've received is actually is quite valid in that regard. But then a major update will really be the first step into actually quantifying carbon emissions. And so for that, we're going to start with that live interactive map of hashing facilities by regions. And so for that, we'd love to actually hear from miners that operate hashing facilities and would like to contribute to that project, or local power stations, other researchers, especially in areas where we have language barriers or difficulties. And so, in case someone's listening to this and would like to get involved in a project in some way or another, just feel free to reach out to me.
Cool. And so how do people find out more? And how do they get in touch with you?
So
give you a shout out.
They can go first to the website, so it's cbeci.org. So we have a contact form there, or otherwise can just message me via Twitter. It's actually easiest probably, so that's at @mrauchs. I'm actually also fairly active on Twitter. I genuinely respond to most comments I get. So that's the two best ways I would say to reach out.
Cool. And what event am I going to see you at next? What do you got coming up?
Well, fortunately for now, I have got an event pause because I need to finish a report. And frankly, I've been traveling so much over the last 1.5 months. So it's good to actually get some focus to get some work done. But otherwise looking forward. I'm going to be at Scaling Bitcoin, so I'm not sure if you're going to be there.
Is that in Israel?
Tel Aviv.
Yeah, I am thinking about going to that. So the next couple I'm thinking of going to is that, and I'll be at the Honey Badger Baltic.
Yeah, so that's just immediately after Tel Aviv, right? Yeah. Yeah,
so I'm thinking I'm just going to head over to Tel Aviv and then go to Latvia for that afterwards. I think that's going to be quite good.
Yeah, probably same for me. So I guess we're going to bump into each other again.
Definitely. All right, mate. Well, listen, look, thanks for coming on, Michel. I know it's short notice, but I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to get this out as a bonus release this week, so it's going to be a 3-show week, but I appreciate you coming on and doing this.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a good discussion.
All right, what did you make of that? Did you enjoy that? Just need to say a massive thanks to Michel for doing this interview at short notice. I really enjoyed it. Even though some of my assumptions were wrong, I definitely learnt from it. Also, make sure you check out the index. It's linked in the show notes. I found Michel's viewpoints incredibly refreshing. He's really level-headed in his predictions, and I think the project's fascinating. And while it is work in progress, the data is definitely useful and really easy to understand and follow. And I know they're going to be doing a lot more. So I'm looking forward to some of the updates that are going to be coming soon, how it evolves. But definitely go and check it out. And if you enjoyed the show, if you've got any questions, you can feedback to me. You can reach out. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. I usually pretty much reply to anyone unless you're sending me some nonsense. Again, thank you to everyone who supports the show. I'm not going to go through the list today because I've got another interview coming up with Safety, which I need to prep for. But if you do want to support the show, just head over to my website. It's whatbitcoindid.com. Click on the support section. It will tell you everything you can do. Even a review up on iTunes is super helpful. As I mentioned, I'm out in the States here at the moment. I'm going to be here for another 13 days before I head back home, and then I'll be heading off on holiday. I've got loads of shows backed up, so I can kind of have a break for once. Anyway, if you've got any questions, get in touch. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com.